Hey guys, human rights attorney Lee Dundas here. It's Tuesday, the evening of December 8th in California, and I want to take a couple of minutes tonight and talk to you about the chess game regarding the election that I see being played out right now, both the pieces that we can see and additionally pieces that I think people are not focused on that they should be focused on and I think would make people breathe a lot easier. By way of backdrop, the first thing to know and the first thing that I want to really convey is we're at war. I repeat, we are at war right now. Cyber warfare is the new warfare. If you can rig an election and install your puppet government in a foreign country of your choosing so that you don't ever have to invade that country and have a single loss of life, and all you need to do is sit behind a keyboard and rig the election so that then you can control that government and therefore that entire country, you have won a war without having to fight that war. But it is no less a war if that is what is in fact going on. And with that said, no war was ever won by our troops going up across enemy lines and listening to the other enemy's general, propaganda machine and drinking from the keg of their information before we come back and say, okay, now charge the hill. Our guys would be demoralized, they'd be apathetic, they'd be like, sir, it's never gonna work. Yeah, why? Because you've been drinking from the other guy's PR machine. So if you're getting demoralized right now, turn off the boob tube. If you don't know which side of this mainstream media is on already, God help me, you shouldn't be watching my video right now, okay? Secondly, when it comes to war, wars are never won, or very rarely are they won, by going through the front door. You don't knock on the front door and say, hey, I'm about to invade you, because then you get one hell of a defensive mechanism ensuing. Oh, no, you're not. Let me get my guns and my knives and fight you off. Wars are won by going in side doors and back doors and by subterfuge and all sorts of, art of war type stuff. And I'll give you some examples. There was a Chinese general way long ago from the Three Kingdoms period, and he saw an advancing army. And he knew they had more troops than they needed to take his little fortress and that he didn't have enough of his own troops to defend it. So he bluffed. He pulled his guys into his fortress, threw the doors wide open, went up on the wall of the castle and started playing music. And the other general of the advancing enemy army came up and was like, there's a dude playing music and he's a general sitting on top of the fortress. It must be a trap. We're going to leave this one alone, and walked right on by a fortress that he could have owned because the bluff was successful. D-Day is another example of that. When we invaded Normandy, Hitler was all confused because we had been running Operation Bodyguard for weeks and weeks leading up to that, saying that D-Day was going to happen way later. It was going to happen in the south of France or somewhere else. And so he had sent his troops all over the place, but he didn't have them on the beaches of Normandy to fight our guys off. Bill Gates, prime example, although it pains me to speak of it. The year was 1980. He represented to IBM. He had an operating system when he didn't have jack squat. And then he had to make good. So he went to a 2-bit Seattle outfit, paid $25,000 for a license for an operating system, had his guys tinker with it, renamed it MS-DOS, and the rest is history. Okay, so right now, what you see going on is all of America is myopically focused on this little chessboard. And they're like, oh my gosh, the pawn in Georgia took a hit today. And the next hit, might be fatal if the queen takes her out. And we've got all our panties in a frumple over it. The first thing to know is, A, the pawn's not dead in Georgia or anywhere else. 2, okay, even if it does die, it's one pawn. You got a bunch of others on the board. 3, even if you lose all your pawns, you've got way more important players in your back row that can really sway the game a lot more than a single pawn can. And finally, and most importantly, in taking this out of real life chess, I believe that there are chess pieces on the board that none of us can even see if we are not in Trump's inner circle. I think we may not even be playing a chess game. The real game may be a game of Battleship being played 3 doors down or 3 cities over. And we're sitting here thinking a game of chess is being played and we're all focused on the pawn right now today, this week. So I do want to talk about the pawns on the board that we can see, the judicial actions, legislative actions, if you will, for the first couple minutes of this. But then I want to really move on and start talking about the things that I think are pivotal, that nobody is really focused on, that I think are way more important in the long run. Okay, as a backdrop, a couple of pieces of news from the last 24 hours. First, the Joint Congressional Commission on Inauguration Ceremonies again voted down a resolution to acknowledge Joe Biden as president-elect. They are refusing to acknowledge Joe Biden as president-elect. Okay, some food for thought. Second of all, right now in Michigan, per court order from a judge who got it right, there are 22 Dominion machines that are being analyzed by a forensic team of guys who know what they're doing in that regard. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see where that goes. Third, Jen Ellis said today that she is confident at least one swing state is going to take back the power to select electors and do their own thing and switch their votes behind Trump, which is what their votes indicated it should have been anyway, and that they have a multiplicity of other states that they are working on in a similar vein. From the White House today, or yesterday I think it was, Trump said, the election was rigged. We've heard him say that before. And you're going to see a lot of big things happening over the next couple of days. And then he declined to say what. At the Arizona press conference, where a contingent of Arizona Republican legislators were asking their state to decertify their own election results, at the end of that, you had one of the legislators take a microphone and say, there's a lot happening behind the scenes that we are not aware of. And I believe President Trump will be sworn in. For what it's worth, I think this woman was on the money. There is a lot going on behind the scenes that the average person is not aware of, and I do believe President Trump will be sworn in, and so should you. Sidney Powell has said that there are going to be at least 3 states before the Supreme Court by the end of the week, which cumulatively, of course, have the ability to sway this election. And some final interesting food for thought. Kamala has not given up her Senate seat here in California yet. For comparison, Obama gave up his seat 3 full weeks earlier. He announced on November 13th. Is there a reason for that? Probably. All right, so we already know about Arizona's Republican legislature and legislators and what they're asking to have done there. You should also know the Arizona Supreme Court has been asked to hear, and I think is going to hear, a lawsuit challenging certification. Georgia, we all know Sidney Powell was denied by a judge there who went, oh my gosh, you're asking for the most extraordinary relief ever requested, ever anywhere on the planet, and I just can't rise to the occasion and do that. With all due respect to that judge, that wasn't his job. I'll repeat, even though I'm just a lowly lawyer in California, that wasn't his job. His job was to look at the mountains of evidence that were before him and say, hey, is there sufficient evidence of fraud here? Oh my gosh, fraud that is also on an extraordinary amount, tantamount to an electronic coup that might have had foreign involvement, and rule on that, and then figure out what the heck he was going to do to unwind that fraud in terms of judicial relief. But I guess he wasn't up to that. So now you've got an appeal being sent up to the 11th Circuit there. Okay, and then today, God bless Texas, their Attorney General filed suit against 4 swing states. That triggers what's known as original jurisdiction, meaning there's only one court in the land that can hear when a state is arguing with another state, and that, of course, is the U.S. Supreme Court. The basis of their argument is the fact that secretaries of state that were off the reservation making their own rules up about the election process in Pennsylvania and Georgia, places like that, were not allowed to do what they did. It is pretty clear the Constitution delegates the power to make rules about elections to the state legislature. And only the state legislature. So I think there is a more than fair argument to be made here that any Secretary of State shooting from the hip doing her own thing didn't have the authority to do what she was doing. Okay, so now that we've cleared away the pawns that everybody can see, I want to focus on the Insurrection Act for a minute. For those of you who aren't aware, there is an act called the Insurrection Act that allows the president to call into service the U.S. military and the National Guard to address insurrections under a few limited circumstances, one of which is if a state legislature asks the president to do so. So theoretically, a state legislature that we've seen acting very excitedly in the last few weeks over this issue could make a request to the president for that type of relief. But the thing I really want to talk about is the third prong under which the Insurrection Act can be invoked. By the way, insurrection, if you're not familiar with the term, because it's not something we talk about in daily life, even I don't, is basically a rebellion of the citizens of a country against the government. So say China sends in a bunch of spies or foot soldiers to surround the White House and try to overthrow the White House, and we've got turncoat American citizens who decide to try to help out and take out the sitting president. That would be an insurrection. We've got people rising up in our own country trying to unseat our government. And the president would be well within his rights to invoke this act to quell that insurrection at that point in time. And my question for you is it any different if China doesn't send actual foot soldiers in, but does that by way of a keyboard, and there are people in this country helping them, I think the answer is there isn't a difference. It's a difference without a distinction. I don't think there's a difference there. But going back to what the text says of the Insurrection Act, whenever the president considers that unlawful obstructions or rebellion against the authority of the U.S. make it impracticable to enforce the laws of the U.S. in any state, by the ordinary course of judicial proceedings, the president may call into federal service the use of the armed forces as he considers necessary to enforce those laws or suppress the rebellion. Specifically, the president, again I'm quoting now, by using the armed forces or by any other means, shall take such measures as he considers necessary to suppress any insurrection or conspiracy, if that insurrection or conspiracy so hinders the execution of the laws of the state that any part or class of its people in that state, right, are deprived of a right named in the Constitution. Well, what are rights named in the Constitution? The right to vote, right? And the constituted authorities of that state are unable, or they fail, or they refuse to protect that right. And again, what is the right? The right to vote. In any of these situations that I just enumerated, the state shall be considered to have denied the equal protection of laws secured by the Constitution. Now, I want you to replay what you've been hearing on the media channels regarding Giuliani and some of the other cases that have been filed in recent weeks. They've been brought on equal protection grounds. And we see them saying things like, oh, it's not fair. If the citizens in one county had votes that were counted this way and the citizens in a neighboring county, didn't have the votes counted that way, it denied equal protection. There's equal protection issues there. Well, is that a good judicial challenge? Is it a good argument to make to a court? Yeah. But what else does that argument do? It tracks the language I just read you out of the Insurrection Act. All right, so most recently this act was used, in case you're not familiar, to suppress the Rodney King riots. Back when I was in law school, hopped off the freeway driving through LA and found myself face to face with a tank full of U.S. Army clad folk. And that was our military on the streets of our country suppressing under the Insurrection Act that had been invoked the uprising. You also saw it during the days of the desegregation and the fact that the southern schools were not integrating. So we sent troops to those southern schools to forcibly integrate the schools in the South when the governments of those states refused to do it back in the, a few decades ago in the 60s. And then prior to that, you saw this playing out during the Civil War. Now, the interesting thing about the military, once you call up the military and put it in the saddle, is they have their own separate system for judicial things. It's called military tribunals. And you may be interested to know that our government has, in fact, used those types of military tribunals in the past against American citizens who were involved in a plot to overthrow the United States president. And that was Abraham Lincoln. And they took the co-conspirators who were involved in that plot to take out Lincoln, and they tried them in military tribunals. And they justified their actions by pointing to the military nature of the conspiracy and the fact that the defendants had acted as enemy combatants, right? They got death by hanging and life in prison, in case you're curious. So what did we see in an executive order in September of 2018? We saw our president declare a national emergency to deal with a threat. And what was that threat? The threat of interference in our elections by foreign nationals, potentially using digital means and people in our country to help, right? And he termed that an unusual and an extraordinary threat to national security that warranted a declaration of national emergency. And now we see that the vote may have indeed been swayed. So I think those are things to sort of think with. I also want to talk to you about a couple of amendments you may not be familiar with. We've got the 14th Amendment, which, if you're not familiar, whole separate side door into the House here, says when the right to vote in any election for the choice of electors for president of the U.S. is denied to any inhabitant of a state, the basis of the representation therein shall be reduced proportionally, basically. So they can start stripping electoral votes if they find that that occurred. Something to think about, right? 12th Amendment, if nobody gets to a clear majority, if nobody gets over 270, we have the fact that the votes will be taken by the states and the representation from each state will have one vote. And of course, Republicans would be ahead in that count. So for all of you folks who are going, but how come President Trump isn't invoking the Insurrection Act yet? And what you need to realize is the Insurrection Act is able to be used once we have a showing that the states are unable, or they fail, or they refuse to protect a constitutional right. And what you're seeing play out right now with all this drama in the Arizona legislature and the Pennsylvania and the Georgia legislatures and the courts in these states is you're seeing the states struggle with whether they're going to be able to rise to the occasion. And either they will or they won't. Like today, the court in Georgia didn't. And it may be because those courts just don't have the mettle needed to do what needs to be done. These are extraordinary times. But I can tell you something. The judges who are sitting in military tribunals, I believe, are cut from a vastly different cloth than the guys you see sitting on the regular courts here in the United States. So we're in the middle of that right now, and I would encourage you to not get overly wrapped up in the machinations of any 1 hour or 1 day. Just take a deep breath, and the biggest thing you can do right now is stay the course. And the second and most equal important thing you can do is show up. I am going to be speaking on the steps of the United States Supreme Court this Saturday at a huge Trump rally at 10 a.m. Rally's going to go all day. As I mentioned at the outset, this is a war, and you are in it, whether you realize you're in it or not. And you have a choice. You have a choice this weekend and every day, really, but especially this weekend, to show up for the man that is standing between tyranny and communism and freedom, or to sit on the couch and eat Fritos and look back 3 months from now and wish you had shown up. This is history in the making, and the outcome of it could not be more important, guys. It is going to determine the rest of your entire damned life. It's a $100 flight into Washington, D.C. Come help history be made instead of just watching it from the couch. I'll see you on the U.S. Supreme Court steps on Saturday. Take care.